Hello and welcome to Behind the Bar. Today we're having a little look at all things American whiskey, so I brought in my resident whiskey expert, Fred Siggins, to have a little chat about it. Rye, I feel, kind of was a little bit out of vogue for quite a while, but it is having a bit of a resurgence now.
In the last 20 years or so, A, people have gotten really interested in classic cocktails, and B, people are just pretty into whiskey these days. Broadly speaking, as we said, rye whiskey is just going to be drier and spicier because it's based on that rye grain. Within that, the most obvious thing would then be ryes that are a very, very high rye mash bill, so using almost or completely 100% rye grain, and those that just sort of get across the line by using a minimum amount of rye and then having a lot of corn or other grains in there to soften them out a bit. So the two examples that we've got in front of us would be Wild Turkey and Bullet. So Wild Turkey would be really pretty traditional, sort of a little bit balanced between the rye grains and a significant portion of corn that's going to be in there as well. Whereas the Bullet is, I believe, 95% rye, so it's going to be particularly dry and spicy.
Yeah.
So again, if you're making a cocktail, that's the sort of choice that you have if you really want to push that heavy rye flavor, or if you want something that's going to be a little bit softer and sweeter and more sort of balanced out.
And also, obviously, you kind of want to think about what else is going into the cocktail. So for instance, if you're doing a Manhattan and you're doing it with like a lighter vermouth, then you probably want to do it with like your Wild Turkey. If you're doing it with a richer, heavier vermouth, then that will stand up to the Bullet rather than getting, a little bit lost.
Absolutely. So the other ryes that we have on the table in front of us are Michter's and Sazerac. I really like both of these products, basically just because they're delicious, they're well made. I suppose the biggest difference between them and Wild Turkey, first of all, is going to be price point. They're a little bit more expensive, a little bit more sort of premium, but what you're going to get for that is probably a little bit more complexity, maybe a little bit more appropriate as sipping whiskies as opposed to just mixing whiskies. And with the Sazerac in particular, you're also going to see a little bit higher alcohol content. This one's bottled at 45%. So again, going to give you a little bit more punch and a little bit more character if you're sipping on it, and also some of that higher alcohol content that makes it a little bit easier to work with for cocktails.
Yeah.
If you're after a little bit more of a premium Manhattan, those are really good ones to go with.
The one thing, I'm not sure if any of these do have it, but that you see on rye bottles quite a lot is bottled in bond. What does that mean? Is that an indication of quality? Like, is that something that you want to be looking for on your rye?
Bottled in bond basically means that the whiskey has never left a government bonded warehouse. So a government agent would actually come around to that warehouse every year or every month or every 6 months, whatever it was, and check and make sure that all of those barrels were still there and that they actually had seals over them to prove that nobody had tampered with the barrels, added anything to them or siphoned anything off of them. And in the United States, if you say bottled in bond on the label, it also means that it needs to be at least 100 proof or 50% alcohol. So there's not that many bottled in bond American whiskies available in Australia, but Rittenhouse Rye would be a sort of obvious example of one, so much higher alcohol content from those ones.
Yeah.
I hear questions about these different terms that we see on whiskey labels coming out of the United States all the time, things like straight rye and bottled in bond. And to be perfectly honest, it's a bit technical. It doesn't necessarily tell you a whole lot about what's in the whiskey. These laws are more kind of left over from a time in history when there was a lot of pretty dodgy whiskey on the market, and so the government tried to create certain laws to help lock that down.
And so that kind of leads me to my next question. What does straight mean on these labels?
So it is a good question because it's something that you see on most American whiskey labels, and again, it's one of those things that was sort of left over from a time when the Americans were really trying to settle on what was a quality whiskey, basically to ensure a certain level of quality in the market. And there was this tension during the sort of explosion of whiskey that was happening in places like Kentucky and Tennessee around the distillers who are actually making genuine whiskey, and then the sort of rectifiers and blenders who were taking maybe neutral spirit and flavoring it with caramel coloring and oak chips and stuff like that, and making something
delicious.
Yeah, I know. And they were still labeling that as whiskey, but the guys who were actually making the real deal were getting pretty upset about that and saying, how are people out there supposed to know what a genuine whiskey is? So straight means that something can't be distilled to more than 80% alcohol, has to be made with cereal grains. So basically you're still tasting the grains that are actually going into it, and then has to be aged in a new oak barrel for at least 2 years. So for all intents and purposes, everything that is currently available or that is currently made in the United States and labeled as bourbon or rye is going to be straight. It's been a long time since anyone was basically, making whiskey flavored vodka and trying to flog it off as whiskey.
Yeah. Now, we've obviously covered kind of what is coming out of the United States. Mm-hmm. The other big one that a lot of people will know is Canadian whiskey. Obviously, Canadian Club does very well for itself.
Sure.
Is there any kind of any difference there between that and your bourbons and ryes?
Yeah, absolutely. The big difference is with Canadian whiskey, it's still mostly made from corn. So similar to bourbon in that way, and different from Scotch whiskey or single malt whiskey, because we're not talking about malted barley. We're still talking about a predominantly corn-based whiskey. The big difference between Canadian whiskey and American bourbon is that in Canada, they almost always use barrels that have been used previously, as opposed to those brand new barrels that the Americans are always using. Which means that Canadian whiskey is not going to be anywhere near as intensely oaky as American bourbons and ryes.
It is a little bit funny as well, because I think in Canada they can call it a rye whiskey as long as it has some rye in it. It doesn't have to be 51%. So you will see Canadian whiskies that are labelled as rye, which are not particularly rye-ish.
Yeah, and a lot of Canadians actually refer to their own native whiskey as rye, just as a general way of talking about whiskey. So it can be a little bit confusing, and it's good to sort of understand the difference between American rye, which definitely has quite a high rye content, and Canadian rye, which might not.
Yeah, because again, if you do like a Canadian rye whiskey, you're not necessarily then going to like something like Bullet Rye.
Exactly.
And then we've got a couple of little kind of interesting ones on the table here.
In recent years, there's also been a really cool craft whiskey movement developing in the United States. And these guys are producing all sorts of interesting stuff in a range of different styles. And so the example that I've got here is Hudson, which was the first whiskey distillery to open in New York since Prohibition. But it was only really a few years ago that these guys opened up shop and started producing American whiskeys there, basically in the Hudson Valley, north of New York City.
Yeah.
So these guys, they basically use small casks. So they're getting a lot of oak influence into the whiskey in a relatively short period of time. So generally aging for a little bit less than most people would. But this is just one example of a cool craft whiskey coming out of the United States. You've got people who are also making single malt whiskey in the US now. So kind of a combination between Scotch and American whiskey, because they're making it with malted barley, but still aging it in those brand new barrels. So getting that intensity of oak that you would expect. There's guys like Balcones down in the Southwest who are using things like native styles of corn, like heirloom corn grains, and using mesquite smoke in their production processes and stuff like that. So there's a lot of really interesting and fun whiskeys coming out of the United States now, outside of the stuff that you can get from the big commercial distilleries.
Yeah. And then also, I guess, with the resurgence of whiskey in general, you're seeing kind of like what you were saying, and making almost a Scottish type whiskey in the States. We've also got American style whiskies being made in Australia now.
Yeah, absolutely. As part of the whole kind of craft whiskey movement and craft distilling movement that's happening in Australia right now, for the most part, what we do is make Scottish style whiskies, so single malt whiskies, but there are some companies that are definitely playing around with American style whiskies as well. Lime Burners out in Western Australia is a good example. They make both rye and corn-based whiskies. And then a brand new one that's just popped up here in Melbourne is the Gospel, which is 100% Australian rye whiskey made right over in Brunswick. And so this one has just hit the market because it's made with 100% rye. It's got big, beautiful sort of fruit characteristics and a really intense rye character that's very fun. And I think people are gonna have a lot of fun making cocktails and just drinking that one. So it's cool to see some of these styles coming out of the Australian local craft spirits movement as well.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. It's definitely a pretty comprehensive overview, I think. Got into a little bit more detail than I did in my previous video. Hopefully it's a little bit useful for you guys as well, whether you're sort of looking to get into American whiskey or whether you already drink it but want to know what other kind of styles and fun things that are out there to try. Let me know in the comments if you have a favorite or what cocktails you like to use it in as well.